I never expected that agreeing to babysit a plant would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but my life before Julian was a series of quiet, predictable loops. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk to write, eat lunch, write more, take a walk, make dinner, read, sleep. It was a perfectly fine life for a freelance editor like me, a life built on routine and the comfortable solitude of my second-floor apartment. It wasn't lonely, not exactly. It was just quiet, a calm lake without a single ripple. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 28, and my biggest adventure was trying a new blend of coffee beans. My apartment overlooked a shared courtyard, a little patch of green that was mostly neglected until Julian moved into the ground floor unit across the way. He was a force of nature, a stark contrast to the sleepy quiet of the building. He was loud on the phone, his laughter echoing off the brick walls. He worked on his beat-up pickup truck with the radio blasting. He was all muscle and sun-browned skin, a landscape gardener who seemed to carry the scent of soil and sunshine with him wherever he went. I watched him sometimes, from the safe distance of my window. It was harmless observation, I told myself. I was just appreciating the view. He had a way of moving, a solid, confident grace that was utterly captivating. He'd wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand, or haul 50-pound bags of mulch over his shoulder as if they were nothing. He was, in every conceivable way, the kind of man I'd learned long ago not to even think about. He was a poster boy for a life I didn't live, for a world that felt a million miles away from my own. He was an impossibly bright sun, and I was just a quiet satellite, content to orbit from a distance, completely unseen. I had constructed an entire narrative for him in my head. He probably had a girlfriend, a pretty one who loved football and beer. He probably spent his weekends at loud bars with his friends, all of them just like him. He was straight. Of course he was straight. It was a foregone conclusion, a fact as solid and unchangeable as the brick of the building that separated us. This assumption was a form of self-preservation, a shield I used to temper the quiet ache of longing that sometimes surfaced on lonely nights. It was easier to admire from afar when you were convinced there was no other option. We had a nodding acquaintance, of course. We'd pass each other on the walkway, and he'd give me a quick, friendly nod. "Morning," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. I'd manage a quiet, "Hey," in return, my heart doing a stupid little flip-flop in my chest before I'd hurry inside, my cheeks warm. For months, that was the full extent of our interaction. A handful of words, a few fleeting glances. He was just the handsome guy downstairs, a pleasant but distant part of my daily scenery. I was perfectly content with that arrangement. Or so I told myself. Because a calm lake can look peaceful, but underneath, the water can be deep and full of things you'd rather not acknowledge. Then came the storm. Not just a regular spring shower, but one of those epic, week-long deluges the weather forecasters get breathless about. They were predicting torrential rain, flash floods, and winds strong enough to knock over anything not tied down. I stocked up on canned soup and checked my window seals, preparing to hibernate and get a lot of work done. I had no idea that the storm was about to bring the outside world crashing right into my quiet, orderly life. It was the evening before the rain was supposed to start. The sky was already a bruised purple-gray, and the air was thick and heavy with humidity. I was watering my own sad little collection of succulents when I heard a frantic knock on my door. It was so unexpected that I actually jumped. No one ever knocked on my door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I went to open it, my mind racing through a list of terrible possibilities. When I opened the door, Julian was standing there. He looked stressed. His hair was a mess, like he'd been running his hands through it, and there was a worried crease between his brows. He was holding his phone in one hand and shifting his weight from foot to foot. For the first time, his usual aura of easy confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, anxious energy that was startlingly human. "Hey man, Lucas, right?" he asked, his voice a little strained. I just nodded, my own voice having apparently abandoned me. "Look, I know this is super random, and we don't really know each other, but I'm in a huge bind." I found my voice, though it came out as a squeak. "Oh, okay. What's up?" He let out a long, frustrated breath. "It's my mom. She fell and broke her hip. I have to drive up to see her, like, right now. I was supposed to deliver this plant to a client tomorrow, but with this storm, I can't leave it outside. It's delicate. He gestured vaguely toward the courtyard. And I can't take it with me. It's huge. He looked at me then, a direct, pleading look that made me feel about 10 feet tall and also about 2 inches tall at the same time. I was just wondering, and it's totally cool if you say no, but could I maybe stash it in your apartment for a few days? Just until the storm passes and I get back? I'll be back Sunday. I'd owe you big time. My brain short-circuited. Julian. In my apartment. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. All my carefully constructed routines, my quiet solitude, were about to be invaded by him, or at least by his client's plant. But looking at the genuine worry on his face, at the way his shoulders were tensed with stress about his mother, I couldn't say no. That's the thing about the shields we build. They're no match for a simple, honest moment of human vulnerability. Yeah, I heard myself say. Yeah, of course. No problem at all. The relief that washed over his face was like the sun breaking through the clouds. And just like that, the ripple had started. Bringing the plant inside was an operation. It was this enormous, ornate terracotta pot holding a Japanese maple with leaves the color of burgundy wine. It was heavy and awkward, and we had to maneuver it through my doorway with a comical lack of grace, bumping into the walls and each other. For a few minutes, my small entryway was a tangle of limbs and leaves, filled with Julian's muttered apologies and my reassurances. His proximity was overwhelming. I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from him, the scent of fresh dirt, and something uniquely him, clean and masculine. At one point, his arm brushed against mine as we shifted our grip on the pot, and a jolt of electricity shot through me, so potent it almost made me drop my hand. I prayed he didn't notice the way my breath hitched. "All right, where do you want this monster?" he asked, huffing a bit as we finally got it inside. We decided on a spot near the sliding glass door to my little balcony, where it would get some indirect light. As we settled it into place, some soil spilled onto my floor. He was instantly apologetic, looking around for something to clean it with. "Don't worry about it. I've got it," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. But he insisted, grabbing a dustpan from my kitchen like he already knew where it was. It was a strange, domestic little moment, the two of us cleaning up a small mess on my floor. It felt normal, frighteningly normal. After he was satisfied the floor was clean, he stood and gave the plant one last, fond look. "Thanks again, man. Seriously, you're a lifesaver," he said, turning his full attention to me. That easy smile was back, but it was softer this time, tinged with gratitude. He gave me his number, telling me to call if the plant, and he said this with a completely straight face, started acting up, then he was gone, leaving me alone in my apartment with a massive, beautiful tree that wasn't mine and the lingering scent of his presence. The quiet that descended felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged, filled with the echo of his voice and the memory of his arm brushing against mine. For the next 3 days, the storm raged outside, and I lived with the maple. It was a strange house guest. Its deep red leaves changed the quality of the light in my living room, casting soft, purple-hued shadows on the walls. I found myself talking to it sometimes, just little things. "Hope you're doing okay in here," I'd murmur as I passed. It was a living, breathing piece of Julian's world, right in the middle of mine. It felt like a secret I was keeping. He texted me once, on the second day. A simple message. "Hey, how's the patient?" I spent an embarrassing amount of time crafting a reply, trying to sound casual and cool, not like a guy who was treating a plant like a visiting dignitary. "Doing great," I finally typed. "Enjoying the view." A little bubble with 3 dots appeared and disappeared a few times before his reply came through. "Haha, good. And thanks again. My mom's okay, by the way. Surgery went well." That small detail, the update about his mother, felt incredibly intimate. He didn't have to tell me that. It was a tiny opening, a glimpse into his life beyond the courtyard, and I held on to it. It made him feel more real, less like the unattainable archetype I had built in my mind. He was just a guy who loved his mom and cared deeply about his work. A guy who, for some reason, had trusted me, a virtual stranger, with something he valued. Sunday afternoon arrived, and the rain finally subsided, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. True to his word, Julian knocked on my door right around 4 o'clock. When I opened it, he looked tired from the drive, but he smiled when he saw me, a genuine, warm smile that made my stomach do a little nervous dance. "The hero and the tree," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Both still standing, we moved the maple back outside, the process much smoother this time. We worked in a comfortable silence, our movements more coordinated, as if we'd done this a dozen times before. As we set it down in its spot in the courtyard, I noticed how gentle he was with it, adjusting a single leaf that had gotten bent. It was then that he started talking about it, not just as a plant, but as a living thing with a history. "This one's for a lady named Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice soft. "She's in her 80s. Her husband planted a maple just like it for her on their first anniversary. It got hit by lightning last year. She was heartbroken." He ran a hand over one of the leaves. "I spent months trying to find one that looked just like the one in her old photos. She thinks I'm just her gardener, but I don't know. It felt important, you know. And that was it. That was the moment my carefully constructed image of him shattered into a million pieces. The loud, truck-loving, beer-drinking guy I had invented was replaced by this man, this thoughtful, incredibly kind man who would go to such lengths for an elderly client, just to restore a piece of her happiness. My perception of him shifted, deepened. The attraction that had been a low simmer was suddenly boiling over. It was no longer just a physical thing. It was a profound appreciation for the person he was revealing himself to be. He must have seen something in my expression, because he gave a small, almost shy shrug. "Anyway, it's probably silly." "No," I said, my voice firm, surprising even myself. "It's not silly at all. It's really amazing, Julian." He looked up at me, and our eyes met and held for a beat too long. The air thickened, charged with an unspoken understanding. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection. To break the spell, he cleared his throat and gestured toward my own small balcony garden. "Your succulents look thirsty," he said, a playful smirk on his lips. Before I could get defensive about my questionable plant parenting skills, he disappeared into his own apartment and came back out with a small pair of shears and a little terracotta pot. He walked over to a sprawling jade plant he had near his door and snipped off a healthy cutting. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers warm and calloused against my palm, the touch lingering for just a second. "Here," he said softly, "a thank you gift. Even you can't kill this 1 inch," he was teasing, but his eyes were sincere. It was a small gesture, a simple cutting from a plant, but it felt monumental. It was a promise of future growth, a piece of his world he was willingly giving to me to nurture in mine. I stood there, holding the cutting, long after he'd gone back inside, my heart feeling as fragile and full of potential as the small green stem in my hand. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a text from him. "I owe you a proper thank you. Beer? My place. Say Friday around 8? I read the message 3 times, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was one thing to do a favor in an emergency. It was another thing entirely to be invited into his space, willingly. My mind, the ever-helpful manufacturer of worst-case scenarios, immediately started spinning. What if it was awkward? What if we had nothing to talk about? What if he realized how hopelessly quiet and boring I was compared to him? But underneath the anxiety was a powerful current of hope, a thrilling, terrifying excitement. I texted back a simple, "Sounds great," trying to channel a coolness I was far from feeling. The rest of the week was a blur of nervous anticipation. I tried on 3 different outfits on Friday evening before settling on what I wore every other day: jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. I tried to convince myself it was just a neighborly drink, nothing more, but I couldn't quiet the hopeful hum in my veins. At 8 o'clock on the dot, I knocked on his door, my hands feeling clammy. He opened it with a wide smile, wearing a faded band t-shirt and comfortable-looking sweatpants. He looked relaxed, and it instantly put me a little more at ease. "Hey, come on in," he said, stepping back to let me pass. His apartment was the complete opposite of what I might have expected. I had vaguely pictured a chaotic bachelor pad, maybe some sports memorabilia on the walls. But it was surprisingly neat, warm, and inviting. The walls were a soft, earthy green, and there were plants everywhere, thriving in the evening light. And on the wall above his sofa, there were framed charcoal sketches. They were beautiful, intricate drawings of garden layouts, individual flowers, and landscapes. They were his. "Wow," I breathed out, stopping to look at them. "Did you do these?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a faint blush creeping up from his collar. "Oh yeah? Just a hobby. Helps me plan out projects." He waved it off as if it were nothing, but I could see the artistry, the passion in every line. He was an artist. This rugged, strong man who worked with soil and stone was a delicate, detailed artist. It was another layer, another fascinating contradiction that made my chest feel tight. He handed me a cold bottle of beer, and we sat on his comfortable, slightly worn sofa. The awkwardness I had feared never materialized. The conversation flowed easily, more easily than any conversation I'd had in a long time. We talked about my work as an editor, and he was genuinely interested, asking smart questions. We talked about his landscaping business, and he spoke about it with a mix of pride and frustration that was completely endearing. He told me about growing up in a small town, about the feeling of wanting more, but also missing the quiet. I told him about moving to the city for college and just never leaving. We discovered a shared love for old sci-fi movies and a mutual hatred for cilantro. We talked for hours, the light outside fading from dusk to dark, the only illumination in the room coming from a single warm lamp in the corner. It felt less like a first hangout and more like catching up with an old friend. The easy banter slowly faded into a more comfortable silence. We were sitting a little closer than we had been at the start of the night, the space between us on the sofa having gradually shrunk. I was hyper-aware of his knee occasionally brushing against mine, of the way his profile looked in the dim light as he stared thoughtfully at his half-empty beer bottle. The air between us grew thick again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was charged with a different kind of energy, a quiet, humming tension that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. His gaze was intense, searching. "You know," he started, his voice lower now, softer. I've never really had a guy friend I could just talk to like this." My heart sank a little at the word friend, but I pushed the disappointment down. This was good. Friendship was good. It was more than I ever expected. I gave him a small smile. "Me neither." He held my gaze, and something flickered in his eyes. Something vulnerable. He swallowed, then looked away, as if gathering his courage. "Can I ask you something weird?" I just nodded, my throat suddenly too dry to speak. He turned back to me, his eyes locking with mine again. The playful ease was gone, replaced by a raw, uncertain honesty. "So, what's it like?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, as if the words were foreign in his mouth. "Kissing a guy?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. My mind went completely blank. 1,000 possible answers swirled and vanished before I could grab a single one. Was this a test? A hypothetical question? Was he just curious? I opened my mouth to try and form a coherent thought, to say something, anything, but I never got the chance. Because he didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in slowly, his eyes searching mine for any sign of protest, any hint that I wanted him to stop. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the gravity of his gaze. And then his lips were on mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, hesitant, and full of questions. It was tentative, a gentle exploration in the near darkness of his living room. It tasted of beer and uncertainty and a spark of something I couldn't yet name. It was terrifying, and it was perfect. It was the most perfect, heart-stopping kiss of my entire life. The kiss lasted for only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. When he pulled back, the space between us crackled with a dizzying mix of shock and electricity. His eyes were wide, searching mine, and I could see a flicker of panic in their depths. The vulnerability he had shown just moments before was now warring with a sudden, sharp fear. He looked as stunned as I felt. He stammered, his voice rough. He scrambled back a bit on the sofa, putting a few inches of distance between us. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I don't know why I did that. I'm sorry." The apology was a jumble of words, rushed and clumsy. Before I could process what was happening, before I could tell him it was okay, that it was more than okay, he stood up abruptly. "It's late," he said, not looking at me. "You should probably go." The dismissal was gentle but firm, a clear wall slamming down between us. I was still reeling, my lips tingling, my mind a complete blank. I just nodded numbly, stood up, and walked to the door like a robot. "Thanks for the beer," I mumbled, my voice sounding hollow and distant. He just gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then I was out in the cool night air of the hallway, the click of his door closing behind me sounding like a gunshot in the sudden silence. I practically ran back to my apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs. I closed my own door and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. What had just happened? He had kissed me. Julian had kissed me. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy surged through me, so powerful it made me dizzy. But it was immediately followed by an icy wave of dread. He had apologized. He had kicked me out. He was sorry he did it. The next few days were excruciating. I replayed the entire evening, the kiss, and the disastrous aftermath over and over in my head until the memory was worn smooth. I analyzed every word, every look, every tiny gesture. The earnest question, the tentative way he leaned in, the panic in his eyes afterwards. It was a dizzying pendulum swing between hope and despair. Hope, because the kiss had felt real, like something he genuinely wanted in that moment. Despair, because his reaction told me he regretted it instantly. I became a recluse in my own home. I kept the blinds on my front window closed, terrified of even accidentally seeing him in the courtyard. Every creak in the hallway made me jump. I felt like a fool. I had let my guard down, allowed that fragile seedling of hope to sprout, only to have it stomped on. He was just curious, I told myself. It was a drunken, momentary lapse in judgment. He was straight, and I was his weird little experiment. The thought was humiliating, a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach. I saw him once, from a distance. I was taking out the trash, moving quickly, my head down. He was getting something out of his truck. He saw me. I know he did, because he froze for a second, but he didn't say anything. He just turned and walked quickly back to his apartment, his shoulders tense. The avoidance was worse than an outright rejection. It was a silent confirmation that I had imagined everything, that the connection I felt was a one-sided fantasy. The quiet in my apartment returned, but this time it was heavy and suffocating, thick with unspoken words and the ghost of a kiss. I decided I had to move on. I had to shove the memory into a box, lock it, and throw away the key. I had to go back to my routine, back to being the quiet neighbor he barely knew. It hurt. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. But it was better than living in this limbo of anxious hope. I would be fine. I had been fine before Julian, and I would be fine after. That's what I kept telling myself, anyway. I was just starting to believe it when, on the fourth day of our silent war, there was a knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. I stood there for a long moment, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home. It would be easier, safer. But then I thought of his face, the genuine panic in his eyes that night. It wasn't anger or disgust I had seen. It was fear. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I walked to the door and opened it. Julian stood on my doorstep, looking just as nervous as I felt. He was wearing the same faded band t-shirt, and he was wringing his hands in front of him. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere around my collarbone. The silence stretched for a few seconds, thick and uncomfortable. Can I come in for a minute?" he asked, his voice quiet. I just nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the middle of my living room and just stood there, looking lost. The beautiful Japanese maple was gone, but the ghost of it, the memory of him being in this space, lingered. I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms over my chest. It was a defensive posture, a way to hold myself together. "Look," he started, finally lifting his head to look at me. His eyes were filled with an apology that went deeper than words. "I am so sorry, Lucas. For how I acted the other night. For running away. It was a crappy thing to do, and you didn't deserve that." I just nodded, not trusting my voice. My mind was screaming, "Why did you do it? Why did you kiss me if you were just going to regret it?" As if he could read my mind, he took a step closer. "The kiss," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm not sorry for the kiss. I'm sorry for how I reacted after. I panicked. I've never done that before. Felt that, for a guy." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I've been a wreck for days. I didn't know what to do." He looked at me, his expression open and raw with a vulnerability that stole my breath. "The truth is," he said, "I've been thinking about you for a while now. Ever since I moved in. I'd see you up here in your window, reading or just looking out. And I wanted to talk to you, to get to know you, but I had no idea how. I'm not good at this stuff." He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. The whole thing with the plant. I mean, my mom really did fall, but the plant would have been fine on my covered porch. I used it as an excuse. An excuse to talk to you. To have a reason to knock on your door. My jaw must have dropped. The inciting incident, the entire foundation of our connection, had been a pretext. A sweet, clumsy, over-the-top excuse just to meet me. The cold knot of humiliation in my stomach started to dissolve, replaced by a warm, spreading wave of disbelief and elation. "I really like you, Lucas," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he couldn't hold them in any longer. And that night, when we were talking, it was so easy. It felt so right. And I had to know. I had to know if this thing I was feeling was real. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me. And it was real, wasn't it? It was a question, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like a statement. A confirmation of everything I had been desperately hoping for. The last of my defenses crumbled. "Yeah," I breathed out, my voice thick with emotion. It was real for me, too. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. A smile of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He gently reached out and cupped my cheek, his thumb stroking my skin. The touch was electric, grounding me and sending my head spinning all at once. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." And then he leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It wasn't a question. It was an answer. It was confident and sure. A kiss that spoke of relief and longing and the promise of a new beginning. I melted into it, my hands coming up to grip his shirt as I kissed him back with all the pent-up hope and fear of the last few months. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a conversation, a confession, a mutual acknowledgement that we had both been orbiting from a distance, just waiting for the right moment to finally collide. In the weeks that followed, my quiet, predictable life was wonderfully upended. My apartment was no longer just a solitary refuge. It became our space. It was filled with the sound of Julian's laughter, the scent of the dinners he insisted on cooking for me, and the comfortable silence of two people just being together. The courtyard was no longer a space that separated us, but a place where we'd sit in the evenings, his hand holding mine, as we watched the sun go down. He taught me about plants, showing me how to repot my long-suffering succulents and how to tell what a plant needed just by the color of its leaves. I, in turn, helped him with the wording for his business website, and he'd listen for hours as I told him about the books I was editing. He was fascinated by my world, just as I was by his. We were two different languages, but somehow, we translated each other perfectly. We went on dates. We went to one of those old sci-fi movie marathons we talked about, sharing a giant bucket of popcorn in the dark. He took me to a beautiful botanical garden an hour out of the city, pointing out every rare flower and telling me its Latin name, his eyes bright with passion. I took him to my favorite quiet bookstore, and we spent a whole afternoon just sitting and reading side by side. Every moment felt like a discovery, another piece of a wonderful puzzle falling into place. One Saturday, we were on my balcony, tending to our small but growing collection of plants. The little jade cutting he had given me was now a sturdy, thriving plant in its own pot. He'd brought over others, a small fern, a vibrant coleus, turning my once barren balcony into a tiny green oasis. He was showing me how to prune a dead leaf, his hands gently guiding mine. He paused, his hands still covering mine, and looked around at the little garden we had created. "You know," he said softly, a thoughtful smile on his face. "It all started with a plant." I smiled back at him, my heart feeling so full it might burst. "A plant in a storm," I added. He turned to face me, his expression sincere. "I'm glad there was a storm," he said. "I'm glad my mom broke her hip." I swatted his arm playfully. "Don't say that." He laughed, a real, deep laugh that made me love him even more. "You know what I mean. I'm glad I had an excuse to be a weirdo and knock on the cute editor's door." He leaned in and gave me a soft, lingering kiss. It was a kiss full of comfort and gratitude and the easy intimacy we had built. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. Life is funny, isn't it? You spend so long building walls to keep the world out, to protect yourself from getting hurt, and you think you're safe and content in your little routine. You convince yourself that the quiet is enough. But you never know when a simple, unexpected request, a moment of forced proximity, is going to be the very thing that gently dismantles those walls, brick by brick. You never know when the person you thought was a world away is actually just waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to finally cross the distance and change your life forever.